The fluorescent tube above Bay 3 flickered twice, throwing a cold strobe across the concrete floor before settling into its usual greenish hum. Jack Morrow wiped his hands on a shop rag that had long stopped getting clean and checked the clock bolted to the cinder block wall. 7:47. The Camry belonging to Mrs. Henderson sat with its hood up in Bay 2, the transmission rebuilt 90% finished, just the valve body left a seat and torque. The Wallace kids' truck waited behind it, brake pads ordered, rotors needing to be turned. Tomorrow's work. Tonight was about closing up the ritual that hadn't changed in 7 years. He crossed the floor in 6 steps and began hanging tools on the pegboard, each one returning to its outline, like a shadow finding its body. Half-inch socket wrench, torque wrench, breaker bar. The rhythm was automatic, a muscle memory so deep it had become something closer to prayer. 7 years of this. 7 years since Karen packed a single bag, kissed a sleeping 2-year-old, and drove a Corolla with a bad alternator out of this parking lot and into a silence that never broke. He'd rebuilt the alternator himself 3 months before she left. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could fix anything that had an engine. People were a different kind of machine, entirely one that didn't come with a manual and couldn't be diagnosed by the sounds it made under load. The air compressor kicked off with a shudder that rattled the windows. He checked the pressure gauge, bled the moisture trap, and killed the overhead lights in Bay 1. Outside, the October dark had settled over Cedar Falls like a wool blanket, the kind that smelled like wood smoke and wet leaves. 12,000 people lived in this town, and most of them were already behind curtained windows, the blue flicker of televisions painting their living rooms. Lily was at Ruth's kitchen table right now, probably hunched over a math worksheet, erasing and re-erasing because she couldn't stand messy numbers. She got that from him. The precision, the need for things to be right. The guilt hit him in the sternum the way it always did at closing time, a dull compression that felt exactly like a torque wrench set 2 pounds past spec. He worked too much. He knew it. Ruth told him so weakly, with the kind of cheerful brutality only a mother could deliver. But the garage was the thing that kept the lights on, kept Lily in shoes she outgrew every 4 months, kept the two of them in a house with a furnace that mostly worked, and a yard where a swing set rusted slowly into the earth. Engines didn't lie. They didn't leave. They only broke in ways that labor could fix. That was the deal he'd made with the world after Karen, and so far the world had kept its end. He reached for the last bank of lights, the ones over Bay 3, and his hand stopped an inch from the switch. Gravel. The distinct crunch of tires on the lot outside, slow, deliberate. Not the confident roll of a regular customer, but something more hesitant, like the car itself wasn't sure it belonged here. Headlights swept through the front windows and slid across the pegboard, turning the hanging wrenches into a brief constellation before swinging away. Jack stepped to the side of the window and looked out through glass that hadn't been cleaned since August. A sedan, black, expensive, in the way that didn't need to announce itself. The body lines were tight, the paint deep enough to hold the parking lot's single floodlight. Like a dark mirror, it was not from around here. Nothing in Cedar Falls looked like that, except maybe the mayor's weekend car, and the mayor was in Bend for a conference. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out, mid-30s. Dark hair pulled back in something that had started the day as order and had since surrendered to chaos. A coat the color of cream, tailored, the kind of coat that cost more than his monthly insurance premium. She moved with the deliberate steps of someone running on fumes but unwilling to show it, each stride placed with a precision that suggested she was accustomed to walking into rooms that paid attention. She held a piece of paper in one hand and looked from it to the garage sign and back again, and her face did something he recognized from his own mirror. In the bad years, the expression of someone whose map and territory had diverged and who was not happy about the reunion. He could wait. That was the smart play. She'd realize this was a garage, not wherever she was looking for, and she'd get back in that sedan and carry her expensive problems somewhere else. People with cars like that had options he didn't have the bandwidth to imagine. Their troubles were champagne troubles, complicated in ways that cost money to untangle, and Jack Morrow did not have money. What he had was a socket set, a kid, a mother who didn't understand boundaries, and 16 hours of work lined up for tomorrow. That was plenty, but she looked up, directly at the window where he stood, and the face she showed him was not what he expected. Not entitled, not impatient. Exhausted in the way that went past tired into something structural, as though fatigue had gotten into her foundation and started cracking the load-bearing walls. And underneath that, a stubbornness that he recognized the way you recognize your own handwriting on a letter you don't remember sending. She knocked. 3 raps, firm, evenly spaced, the knock of someone who'd been trained to enter rooms with authority, even when she felt like hiding under the nearest table. Jack stood there for 10 seconds. He counted them against the ticking of the compressor, cooling down. Then he walked to the door and opened it, and the perfume hit him first, something that probably had a name and a price tag with too many digits, cutting straight through the ambient cocktail of motor oil brake dust and cold metal that was the permanent atmosphere of his life. "I'm looking for Jack Morrow." Her voice was level, professional, the voice of a woman who had made 100 phone calls today and had not gotten what she needed from any of them. "You found him. We're closed." "I know." She held up her phone, and on the screen was a text message. He recognized the contact name before he read the words, Ruth Morrow. Of course his mother was involved. The message read, "My son has a loft above his garage. It's not much, but it's safe. Go there." The anger was immediate and familiar, a flash of heat behind his eyes that had nothing to do with this woman and everything to do with Ruth Morrow's constitutional inability to leave his life unmanaged. "How do you know my mother, Serena Caldwell?" That was the name she gave him. It meant nothing to Jack. He didn't follow business news, didn't read the financial pages, wouldn't have recognized a Fortune 500 CEO if she sat in his waiting area and filled out the intake form. What he saw was a woman in an expensive coat standing in his doorway, holding a phone with his mother's name on it, looking like the last 72 hours had beaten her with both hands. She explained. Short sentences, no drama, the facts laid out like parts on a bench. She'd rented a studio in the Prescott building downtown, paid $30,000 up front for a 6-month lease, needed a quiet workspace while she dealt with a legal situation. The landlord, a man named Dominic Farrell, had demanded an additional $10,000 3 weeks in, an access processing fee. She'd refused. He'd changed the locks within the hour. Everything she owned in that space, her equipment, her files, a framed photograph, that was the last physical thing connecting her to someone she'd lost in all of. It was locked behind a steel door that no longer answered to her key. Jack's instinct said no. His mouth was forming the shape of the word when she added the part about the money. Her company's accounts had been frozen. A co-founder named Nathan Cole had filed accusations of embezzlement enough legal weight to trigger a temporary asset freeze, even though the charges were baseless. Her personal cards were maxed on legal fees. The hotels within 40 miles were full because of some regional conference. Her attorney was in New York, not due back until Wednesday. She needed 1 night, maybe 2. "My mother told you about the loft. She told me you would understand what it feels like when everything falls apart at the same time." The sentence landed on something raw, not because it was manipulative, because it was true. Ruth had told a stranger about the worst period of his life, the months after Karen left, when he'd slept on this very shop floor because the house felt too empty, when he'd fed Lily canned soup 5 nights a week because he couldn't afford groceries and couldn't bring himself to ask for help. His mother had packaged that pain into a sales pitch for a woman he'd never met, and the violation of it burned almost as much as the accuracy. He led her upstairs without another word. The loft was exactly what it had always been: 400 square feet of unfinished potential. Drywall half-taped a futon he'd bought at a yard sale in 2019, a mini fridge that hummed like a small aircraft, a bathroom with a door that hung a 1/4 inch off its hinges. No heat up here besides what rises from the garage. Hot water's unreliable. If the toilet runs, you have to jiggle the chain inside the tank. She stood in the doorway and looked at the space the way he imagined. She looked at quarterly reports that missed their projections, assessing, calculating, deciding what could be salvaged. Then she turned back to him and smiled. It was small and tired and real, and it rearranged her face into someone who looked 5 years younger and about 1,000 miles less guarded. A toilet that runs is fine. I just need to be safe. He gave her the key. Their fingers touched during the handoff, a contact that lasted less than a second, and both of them pulled back as though they'd touched a hot exhaust manifold. 3 seconds of silence before he could speak again. Locked the door from inside. Then he was in his truck, in the dark parking lot, engine, idling heater pushing lukewarm air through vents that needed cleaning. He dialed Ruth. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been holding the phone. Did she find you? Jack Thomas Morrow. The full name? She only brought out all three when she was either furious or playing a card she knew would win. That woman came to church last Sunday. First time in years anyone knew has walked through those doors. She sat in the back row and didn't sing a single hymn, and after the service, she helped Mary Fenton carry chairs even though nobody asked. I talked to her. I listened. And when she told me what happened with that landlord, I thought of you. You thought of me. I thought of my son, who slept on a garage floor for 3 months rather than ask anyone for help, who let his pride nearly kill him. I thought of how many people showed up for you when you finally let them, and I thought about what kind of lesson you're teaching Lily if you turn away someone in need. That wealth makes you untouchable, that people who look different from you don't deserve a hand. The words had the precision of ammunition that had been cast specifically for this caliber of argument. Jack sat in the dark and let them hit. Ruth Morrow was many things, most of them inconvenient, but she was not wrong. Not about this. Not about the people who materialized around him during the bad years, like some kind of blue-collar rescue squad, Dorothy at the hardware store, extending his credit without being asked. Ms. Patterson tutoring Lily 3 afternoons a week, refusing even gas money. Old Hank Dillard sending overflow work to a garage that was too new to have a reputation. Nobody forgets when someone helps them at the bottom. And when the chance comes, you pay it back. Tell Lily I'll pick her up at 7:30. He hung up and sat for 10 more minutes watching the loft window. The light came on. She wasn't sleeping. At 11 at night in a loft above a stranger's garage, in a town she'd never heard of until last week, Serena Caldwell was working. He could see her shadow moving across the frosted glass pacing, and he wondered what kind of person paced at 11 in a borrowed room above an oil-stained concrete floor. And then he wondered why wondering about it made something shift in his chest, a loosening of a bolt he'd tightened 7 years ago and checked every morning since. He drove home, put Lily to bed, stood in the hallway and listened to the house settle around him, the familiar sounds of pipes and joists that he'd memorized the way a sailor memorizes the sounds of his ship. Everything was where it should be, except that now 4 miles away, a light was on in a room he had always kept dark, and a woman he didn't know was pacing through a problem he didn't understand. His phone buzzed. Ruth Lily wants to know if Serena can come to dinner this week. What should I say? He stared at the screen for 30 seconds. Then he typed, tell her yes. Morning came with frost on the windshields and a sky the color of unprimed drywall. Jack drove to the garage at 6:15, stopped at the diner, and picked up 2 egg sandwiches and 2 coffees without thinking about why he was ordering double. The parking lot was empty except for the black sedan, which wore a thin coat of ice-like armor. She came down the stairs at 6:40, and she was a different person. Jeans that had been folded in a suitcase, a charcoal sweater with a collar that had seen better days, no makeup, hair, and a ponytail that made her look like a graduate student pulling an all-nighter. Younger, realer, also more tired, which shouldn't have been possible but was. You didn't have to do that. She was looking at the sandwich and the coffee on the bench he had cleared next to the bay 2-tool chest. I didn't. I always get 2. This was a lie, and they both knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it, which was its own kind of honesty. She wanted to pay. For the loft, for the food, for the imposition of her presence in a life that hadn't asked for complications. Jack waved it off. Consider it a favor to my mother. She'll guilt me for the next 6 months if she finds out I charged a church visitor rent. Serena asked if she could use the small office at the back of the shop. He pointed to it, a closet-sized room with a metal desk, a calendar from 2022, and a phone that still had a cord. She disappeared inside and began making calls. Through the thin wall, he heard her voice change. Not the careful, measured tone from last night. This was different. Calm on the surface, but beneath it, a tensile strength that reminded him of the high-carbon steel he used for specialty repairs. The kind that could flex without breaking, that you had to heat to extreme temperatures before it would bend at all. She wasn't begging anyone. She wasn't pleading. She was building something. He could hear it in the way her questions accumulated, each one a brick placed on the one, before each answer adding a row to a wall that hadn't existed an hour ago. By 10 o'clock, she'd emerged and asked if he had a moment. The small office had been transformed. His old whiteboard, which he'd shoved behind the water heater 3 years ago, was propped against the wall and covered in timeline marks and names. Copies of a lease agreement were spread on the desk beside bank transfer receipts and printed emails. A legal pad showed a list of addresses in handwriting that was simultaneously elegant and aggressive. Each letter formed with the pressure of someone who'd been told once that penmanship mattered and had never been able to let the lesson go. Look at this, she pointed it to the lease. Jack took it and read it the way he read diagnostic reports, slowly looking for the thing that didn't match. It took him 3 minutes. The lease says you get the keys on the 15th, but this receipt shows you didn't get access until the 20th, 5 days late. And this payment went directly to Farrell's personal account, not through a property management company. Her eyes changed. How did you notice that? I read contracts the way I read engines. You look for the part that doesn't match the spec. She showed him what she'd already found. Dominic Farrell owned 4 properties in Cedar Falls. 7 complaints had been filed against him in the past 18 months. Not one had gone anywhere because the amounts were too small for anyone to bother pursuing, and the tenants were too broke, too scared, or too transient to fight back. It was a pattern, not a single event, not a personality flaw. A system. Jack looked at the whiteboard, looked at the addresses, looked at the woman who'd built a war room in his back office in 3 hours with nothing but a phone and a legal pad. And he thought about something that no lawyer in New York would have suggested, because lawyers thought in statutes and precedents, and what Jack was thinking about was something much simpler. Today's Saturday. People are home. What if we just go knock on doors? The idea was blunt, inelegant, the investigative equivalent of diagnosing an engine by putting your hand on the hood instead of hooking up the OBD scanner. But it was also the thing a community mechanic would think of, because a community mechanic knew that the people in those apartments weren't case numbers. They were neighbors, and neighbors talked to people they recognized. I need you to come with me. Serena said it without hesitation, without apology. I don't know this town. I don't know these people, but they'll talk to you. You're local. You're real. She paused. That's exactly why. They took his truck. The sedan would have been wrong for this, too conspicuous, too alien in neighborhoods where the nicest car on the block was usually a 3-year-old Tacoma. They started at the Prescott building and worked outward through Farrell's other properties, a small apartment complex on Birch Street, a converted warehouse near the rail yard, 2 duplexes on the east side where the town petered out into farmland. The first door they knocked on belonged to an elderly woman named Dorothy Keller, who invited them in for tea, turned out to be nearly deaf, and spent 20 minutes showing them photographs of a cat that had died in 2018 before they gently extracted themselves. Jack found it funny in the way that real life was funny, the absurd collisions of purpose and happenstance, that no screenwriter would bother with because they didn't advance the plot. But life wasn't a plot. It was a series of moments, most of them irrelevant, strung together by the ones that mattered. The second door changed everything. Jolene Harris answered it wearing scrubs covered in cartoon pandas, the uniform of a night shift nurse who'd gotten home 3 hours ago and hadn't slept yet. She was 43, had the bone-deep tiredness of someone who spent her nights keeping strangers alive, and her days trying to keep her own life from falling apart. And when Jack said the name Dominic Farrell, she sat down on her front steps as though her legs had simply decided they were done. 3 years. 3 years of escalating rent increases that weren't in her lease. 3 years of maintenance fees for repairs that never happened. 3 years of threatening letters from a management company that, as far as she could tell, consisted of one guy with a P.O. box and a printer. She had a folder. Not a manila folder, not a business file, but a battered accordion file held together with a rubber band, the kind of thing you keep when you can't afford a lawyer, but you know in your bones that records matter. You want copies? Take the whole thing. I've got backups, 3 years of backups. Her voice was steady in the way that only exhaustion can produce a flatness that was not defeat, but rather the absence of surprise. She'd known this would come. She just hadn't known who would bring it. If it helps take him down, it's worth every late fee I ever documented. Tyler Simmons was 22, a community college student who'd been charged 3 separate times for the same plumbing repair, a furnace that leaked water into his living room ceiling, and that Farrell's contractor had patched with what Tyler was fairly certain was bathroom caulk. He showed them photographs on his phone, the same water stain, the same crumbling drywall, the same invoice from Farrell Properties LLC, dated 3 months apart, each one for $850. Linda Brewer ran a small cleaning company out of a first-floor commercial space in one of Farrell's buildings. She'd signed a lease with no mention of supplemental commercial fees. In month 3, a new line item appeared on her invoice, commercial use surcharge, $2,000 per month retroactive. When she protested, Farrell changed the locks. She'd lost 4 clients while she scrambled to find a new location, nearly went under, and spent 6 months rebuilding from a folding table in her sister's garage. Hearing that story, Jack felt something tighten in his jaw because he knew what it cost to build a business from a garage. He'd done it himself, 9 people total. 9 individual stories of small-scale fraud, each one too minor to trigger the legal system's interest. Each one devastating to the person who'd lived through it. Separately, they were inconveniences. Together, they were a pattern, and the pattern was a machine, and Jack Morrow understood machines. On the drive back, the cab of the truck filled with the particular silence that follows revelation, the quiet space where facts rearrange themselves into meaning. Serena broke it first. Have you done this before, helped people? Jack watched the road, the familiar curves of Route 7, where the pavement cracked every winter and the county filled it every spring. When Karen left, I had a 2-year-old, an $800 bank account, and a lease on a garage with no customers. Dorothy at the hardware store let me run a tab for 4 months. Never asked when I'd pay. Ms. Patterson tutored Lily 3 afternoons a week, drove 20 minutes each way, wouldn't take gas money. Hank Dillard, he owns the parts shop on Main. He sent me his overflow work for a year. Told his customers I was the best transmission guy in the county, which wasn't true yet, but it became true because he gave me the chance to practice. He paused at the stop sign on Cedar and 3rd. Nobody forgets when someone helps them at the bottom. And when the chance comes around, you pay it back. Not because you owe them, because you remember what it felt like to need something and have someone show up. Serena was quiet for a moment. Your mother was right about you. My mother is usually right. Don't tell her I said that. Sunday came with a sky that couldn't decide between rain and regret, and it brought Lily Morrow through the garage's side door at 6:30 in the morning, pajamas under her coat, Ruth 2 steps behind, carrying a bag of groceries and the unshakable certainty that she was in charge. I want to meet the lady who lives in Daddy's garage. Ruth had already commandeered the kitchen. Pancakes appeared with the inevitability of weather. Serena came down the stairs, hesitantly carrying the small, potted plant she'd brought from her car, a gesture so out of place in the concrete and steel environment of the garage that it had the quality of something from a different story entirely. She set it on the bench next to the coffee maker, and Lily studied it with the forensic intensity of an 8-year-old who has decided something requires investigation. Are you in trouble? The question was pure Lily, unfiltered, delivered with the same directness Jack used when he told customers their head gasket was blown. Serena crouched down so she was at eye level, and Jack noticed that she didn't flinch, didn't soften the truth into something easier. Yes, someone took something that belongs to me, and I'm trying to get it back. Daddy's good at fixing things. He'll help. Lily picked up the plant and carried it to the windowsill above the shop sink. It needs light, she announced, and placed it where the morning sun, thin and watery, through the October clouds could reach it. Serena watched her do it, and something moved across her face that Jack couldn't name, but recognized the expression of someone encountering a small kindness they hadn't budgeted for. After breakfast, while Lily helped Ruth wash dishes with more enthusiasm than skill, Serena told him, parents gone in a car accident when she was 19. Her grandfather, Frank, had raised her after that, a retired contractor who taught her that buildings were honest, that you could read a structure's integrity in its foundation, the same way you could read a person's character in how they treated people who couldn't help them. Frank died 2 years ago. Since then, she'd had colleagues, employees, attorneys, board members, a co-founder who was now trying to destroy her. What she hadn't had was a kitchen table with pancakes and a child who talked to plants and a grandmother who cooked without asking permission. I haven't eaten breakfast with people like this in a very long time, maybe ever. Jack wanted to ask more about the grandfather, about the company, about the co-founder who'd frozen her out of her own empire. But before he could, Serena's phone buzzed with an email, and the morning shifted from domestic to dangerous. Farrell had sent a legal letter. Through his attorney, he was accusing Serena of property damage, claiming she'd vandalized the studio before vacating. Attached were photographs, a broken window, overturned furniture, a shattered display case. The implication was clear. He was building a counter-narrative, one that painted her as the aggressor and himself as the victim. Jack took the phone and studied the photographs the way he studied everything, carefully from the edges in. The first image showed broken glass on a concrete floor, shards radiating outward from what had been a picture window. The second showed the studio's interior in disarray, chairs toppled, a desk on its side, papers scattered. The third was a close-up of the broken display case, its glass front spiderwebbed with cracks. He swiped back to the first image and zoomed in on the broken window. In the lower right corner of the photograph, a shard of glass caught the light at an angle that created a reflection. And in that reflection, small but unmistakable, was the image of a man's wrist. A watch. Not a Timex, not a Casio, not the kind of watch a vandal wears while smashing windows. This was a watch that caught light and threw it back in the particular way that only brushed precious metal does. And below the wrist, the toe of a shoe. Leather. Polished. The kind of shoe that had never been near a construction site or a strip mall parking lot. This wasn't vandalism. Jack held the phone out so Serena could see the reflection. This was staged. Whoever took this picture was standing inside the room when the damage was done. You can see his wrist in the glass. That's a $15,000 watch and a $200 shoe. Your landlord set this up and photographed his own work. The silence that followed was the kind that redraws the map. Serena stared at the reflection, then at Jack, and the way she looked at him was different from anything before a recalculation that he could almost hear the sound of assumptions being revised under load. My attorney didn't see that. Your attorney isn't trained to look at reflective surfaces. I am. Engines are full of shiny things that show you what's behind them if you know where to look. Ruth had been standing in the doorway, and she spoke with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent 63 years reading rooms. You need to take this to the police. They drove to the station. Sergeant's desk, then a detective. Thomas Nolan, 35 sharp in the way of small-town cops who'd chosen their jurisdiction deliberately and brought city-trained instincts to a place where they could actually make a difference. He looked at the photographs, looked at the reflection, looked at the folder of complaints from the 9 tenants. He opened a case file, but he was honest about the limitations. Investigation takes time. The DA's office is going to want more than a reflection and a folder of tenant complaints. You need a parallel civil track. Press him from both sides. The photographs were logged as evidence. The tenant statements were noted. The wheels of the system began their slow rotation, and Jack remembered something his father had said once in this very garage 20 years ago. His father had been rebuilding a differential, the kind of job that took patience and precision and an acceptance that some things couldn't be rushed. The gears have to mesh, Jack. You can't force them. You just have to cut them right and trust the engineering. His father had been dead for 11 years now, but his tools were still on the pegboard, and his advice still turned up at the moments when Jack needed something to hold on to. They walked out of the station into air that had turned sharply cold, the first real breath of the approaching winter. Nolan caught Jack at the door, a hand on his arm, voice dropped to a register that didn't carry. Be careful. People like Farrell don't play fair. You've given him a reason to come after you now, not just her. If he's willing to stage property damage and fake photographs, he's willing to do worse. Jack met his eyes. I'm aware. Are you? Because right now you're a mechanic who's gotten himself into a landlord fraud case and the landlord has money connections and a history of making problems go away. You've got a kid. Keep that in mind. They drove back in silence. The afternoon had turned the color of old silver clouds piling in from the coast, the smell of rain mixing with the permanent cedar scent that gave the town its name. Serena sat in the passenger seat and stared at the road, and Jack could feel her thinking the way you feel a change in barometric pressure, a heaviness in the air that meant something was building. You don't have to stay involved. You're living in my garage. I'm already involved. That's not the same thing, and you know it. Helping me find tenants is one thing. Going to the police, having your name on a case file, that's different. Farrell is going to find out. He's going to know it was you who spotted the reflection, and he's going to make your life difficult. Jack downshifted as they turned onto the gravel road that led back to the shop. My life's already difficult. One more thing on the pile doesn't change the engineering. You either build something strong enough to carry the load or you don't. He dropped her at the garage and drove to pick up Lily from Ruth's. On the way back, Lily fell asleep in her car seat with a drawing of a cat clutched in one hand and a graham cracker disintegrating in the other, and Jack sat in the driveway for 5 minutes after the engine died, listening to his daughter breathe and thinking about load-bearing walls. Some structures look solid from the outside, paint-fresh angles, square, everything plumb and true. But the weight was all wrong, carried by elements that were never designed for it, and one day a stress point would fail and the whole thing would come down. Karen had been that kind of structure. Beautiful exterior, catastrophic engineering. He'd spent 7 years making sure he wasn't the same, that every wall in his life could carry what was placed on it, that Lily's world rested on foundations he'd poured himself and tested every day. And now there was a light in the loft that hadn't been there before, and a woman in his life who hadn't been there before, and the familiar architecture of control and routine and solitude was developing cracks he hadn't authorized. He carried Lily inside, put her to bed, brushed the cracker crumbs off her shirt, and stood in the hallway where the house made its nighttime sounds around him. Pipes, joists, the furnace cycling on. Everything was where it should be. Except that 4 miles away, a light was on in a room he'd always kept dark, and a woman he barely knew was fighting a war he hadn't signed up for, and his name was on a police file, and his mother was right about everything, and his daughter had put a stranger's plan on the windowsill because it needed light. His phone buzzed. Ruth Lily wants to know if Serena can come to dinner this week. He stared at the message. The cursor blinked, waiting. In the distance, if he listened hard, He could almost hear the garage settling into its own nighttime quiet, the way buildings do when they think no one is listening. He typed "tell her yes." And then because the house was too quiet and his thoughts were too loud, he walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the dark. Somewhere in that darkness, Serena Caldwell's phone was ringing. The screen would light up with a name: Nathan Cole, the co-founder, the man who'd frozen her accounts and accused her of theft and started the chain of events that ended with her sleeping on a $20 futon above a mechanic's shop in a town she'd never heard of. She wouldn't answer. He knew that without knowing how he knew it. She'd look at the screen 5 seconds, maybe 10, and then she'd tap the red button and let the darkness take the light back. Because some calls you weren't ready to answer. Some fights you had to choose the timing for. And some doors, once you open them, change the shape of every room behind you. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Monday arrived wearing the kind of gray that made Cedar Falls look like a photograph someone had forgotten to develop. Jack was under the Camry at 6:15, draining transmission fluid into a catch pan when the loft door opened above him and footsteps came down the wooden stairs with a rhythm that had changed overnight. Not the hesitant descent of a woman borrowing space, something sharper, each step placed with a deliberate weight of someone going to war. He rolled out from under the car and saw her. Black suit tailored to the centimeter hair, pulled back so tight it changed the geometry of her face. No earrings, no bracelet, nothing that could be read as softness. The woman who'd stood in his doorway 3 nights ago in a wrinkled cream coat in exhaustion was gone. In her place was something architectural, a structure designed to withstand pressure and project force. And Jack understood immediately that this was not the real Serena Caldwell, any more than the tired woman had been. This was a version she built for specific purposes, load-bearing armor for rooms that would try to break her. How do I look? The question was flat, almost clinical, the inquiry of a surgeon checking instruments before an incision. Like someone who's about to ruin someone's day. Good. A car pulled into the lot at 6:45, a rental sedan that was expensive without being ostentatious. The woman who stepped out had the specific kind of fatigue that comes from red-eye flights and insufficient airport coffee. Diane Prescott, 52, Serena's attorney carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had been to more courtrooms than most judges. She nodded at Jack with the brief assessing glance of someone who catalogs everything and comments on nothing. Then the two women were in the sedan and gone, taillights disappearing into the morning fog that hung over Main Street like a theater curtain. Jack went back to the Camry, torqued the valve body, reinstalled the pan, filled the transmission with fresh fluid, 4 quarts of Dextron, 6 red as arterial blood. The work was good. The work was always good. The work was the thing that didn't change when everything else shifted underneath you. And right now, the ground beneath Jack Morrow's feet felt less solid than it had in years. Hank Dillard's truck pulled in at 8:30, the same rust-colored Ford he'd been driving since the Clinton administration bed loaded with parts boxes. Hank was 58 years old and had the conversational style of a man who believed words were a finite resource that shouldn't be wasted on anything that could be communicated through a nod, a grunt, or the strategic placement of a box of spark plugs on someone's workbench. He set down a box of brake rotors Jack hadn't ordered and looked up at the empty loft window, the way a man looks at a weather vane. Heard you've got company. Long story. Long stories are usually the good ones. He pulled a shop receipt from his breast pocket, smoothed it on the bench, and placed a pen on top of it. Mrs. Campbell needs her alternator done by Thursday. Told her you're the guy. A beat of silence. You all right? I'm fine. Hank studied him the way Jack studied engines, looking for the thing that wasn't performing to specification. Whatever he found, he kept to himself. He tapped the box of rotors, once a gesture that somehow communicated solidarity, concern, and a willingness to discuss things further at a later date that both of them knew would never arrive, and then he was gone. Jack's phone vibrated at 11:14. A text from a number he didn't recognize, and then he saw the initial. She must have gotten his number from Ruth because, of course, Ruth had given it to her because Ruth Morrow had never encountered a boundary she didn't consider a suggestion. The restraining order was denied. The judge agreed with us. Farrell's attorney looked like he'd swallowed something he couldn't digest. We got the emergency access order. I can get back into my studio. There was a pause, the three dots pulsing. Then we won. Jack caught himself smiling at a phone screen in an empty garage like a man who'd lost a private argument, and the realization irritated him in the specific way that only involuntary emotions can. He typed back, "Told you." The reply came fast. "We won. Come to the studio at 6. I want to show you something." He finished the Camry, started the Wallace kids' brake job, ate a sandwich at the bench without tasting it. At 5:45, he washed his hands 3 times, which was twice more than usual, and noticed himself doing it and was irritated again and drove downtown. The Prescott building was a 3-story brick structure from 1908 that had been beautiful once and was now the kind of building realtors described as full of character, which meant the plumbing was unreliable and the heating was a negotiation. Serena's studio was on the second floor, and the door stood open. He stepped in high and stopped. The space had been destroyed, not ransacked in the chaotic way of a burglar looking for valuables, but methodically, almost artistically demolished. Drywall punched through in 3 places. The picture window, the same one from the photographs Farrell had sent, now genuinely shattered glass scattered across the floor in a pattern that spoke of repeated blows, not a single impact. Furniture overturned with the systematic thoroughness of someone working through a checklist. Papers everywhere, contracts and spreadsheets and handwritten notes scattered like leaves after a storm. Detective Nolan was already there, latex gloves on camera in hand, a uniformed officer marking evidence tags. He looked up when Jack entered and gave the kind of nod that communicates both acknowledgement and warning. "This is worse than we discussed." Serena stood in the center of the destruction, holding a picture frame. The glass was cracked in a web pattern that radiated from one corner, and through the fractures, Jack could see a photograph, an older man, white-haired, standing on what looked like a building site. Hard hat, slightly crooked, grinning at the camera with the uncomplicated joy of someone doing exactly what they were meant to do. Her hands trembled. It was small, barely visible, a vibration that someone standing 5 feet away might have missed. But Jack was a man who spent his life measuring tolerances in thousandths of an inch, and he saw it. She set the frame down on the one table still upright, placing it with the exaggerated care of someone handling something irreplaceable. "This was my grandfather's. The photograph is ruined." Her voice held steady through the first sentence and cracked on the second, a structural failure so brief that if you blinked, you would have attributed it to the cold air coming through the broken window. "This isn't about money. Money I can earn back. But this," she stopped, pressed her fingertips against the fractured glass as if she could feel her grandfather's face through the damage. Then she straightened and the crack sealed itself and the armor was back in place and whatever had leaked through the fault line was contained again. But Jack had seen it, the first real evidence that the fortress had a foundation, and the foundation was grief, and the grief was still alive. Nolan approached with his notepad. Security cameras in the hallway caught someone entering the building at 2:17 a.m. Saturday. Male medium build, face obscured. "We're pulling additional footage from the business across the street." He paused. "I'd suggest your client document everything for the civil case. Photographs, inventory, estimated damages. The criminal investigation will take its own course, but the civil track can move faster if you push it." They left the building at 7:30. The evening had turned fully dark and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since morning, the first real cold snap of the season. Jack could see Serena's breath in the parking lot light, each exhalation a small ghost that formed and vanished, formed and vanished. "Thank you for coming." She said it without looking at him, eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance where the street lights ended and the dark began. "Didn't do much. You were here, that was enough." A pause. "That's been enough since Friday." Tuesday began with a phone call that changed the architecture of the fight. Jack was rebuilding Mrs. Campbell's alternator, a straightforward job, rotor and stator, and brushes the kind of work that left the conscious mind free to wander while the hands did their choreography. His cell rang at 8:40. Tom Wallace, a regular customer, owned a small fleet of delivery trucks, one of Jack's most reliable accounts. Jack, I got a weird call yesterday. Guy said he was from the Oregon Contractors Board. Said there were complaints about your shop, questioned my judgment for using you. Asked a lot of questions about your billing practices. Tom's voice carried the particular discomfort of a man who was loyal but also nervous, because loyalty costs more when someone is actively trying to price it. I told him I've been coming to you for 5 years and never had a problem, but it spooked me, Jack. Thought you should know. The second call came at 9:15. Mrs. Henderson, the Camry owner, had received a similar contact. Someone claiming to represent a consumer protection agency, asking whether she'd ever been overcharged, whether she was aware of ongoing investigations into moral auto repair. She was 81 years old and had been getting her car serviced at this garage since Jack's father ran it, and the call had frightened her badly enough that her daughter had phoned to ask if Jack was in some kind of trouble. By noon, 4 more calls had been reported. Sandra at the diner told Jack a man in an expensive suit had come in asking about the mechanic's legal problems. Over coffee he didn't drink. A neighbor 2 blocks from Jack's house had been approached while getting her mail. The feed store owner said someone had called asking about Jack's credit history. Each contact was isolated, deniable, too minor to constitute a crime by itself. But together they formed a constellation, and the constellation spelled Farrell. Serena arrived at the garage at 1 o'clock, having heard about the calls from Ruth, who had heard about them from Sandra, who had heard about them from Mrs. Henderson's daughter, because Cedar Falls operated on a communication network that made fiber optics look slow. The anger on her face was immediate and total. Not the cold, controlled variety she deployed in professional settings, but something hotter and less contained, the anger of a person who understood that her presence in Jack's life had made him a target. This is my fault. I brought this to your door. I put you and Lily in the crosshairs of a man who destroys people for a living, and I did it because I needed a place to sleep. The self-recrimination in her voice had a quality Jack recognized. It was the same tone he used on himself at 3 in the morning when Lily had a bad dream, and he wasn't there because he was working late. The guilt of people who believe that everything bad that happens near them is somehow their responsibility. My finances are clean. My books are open. There's nothing to find because there's nothing to hide. He wiped his hands on the shop rag, a gesture that had become unconscious punctuation for every conversation he had in this building. Farrell isn't trying to find something. He's trying to make me spend time, spend energy, spend attention, fighting ghosts instead of fighting him. It's a resource war. He wants us exhausted and distracted. That's exactly right, and that's exactly why it works. He doesn't need to prove anything. He just needs to keep you defending yourself until you're too tired to attack. Nolan called at 3. The news was a sledgehammer wrapped in legal language. Farrell had filed for a restraining order against Jack, claiming harassment, intimidation, and trespassing. Under the temporary order, Jack was required to maintain a distance of 500 feet from all properties owned by Farrell or his holding companies. This included the Prescott building, which meant Jack could not go within 500 feet of Serena's studio. Jack hung up and stood very still in the middle of his garage, hands at his sides, feeling the specific weight of being outmaneuvered by someone who had more money, more lawyers, and fewer scruples. 500 feet. The radius drew a circle around Farrell's properties that cut through downtown Cedar Falls like a boundary on a map. And inside that circle, Jack Morrow was a trespasser in his own town. Hank came by at closing time. Didn't call ahead, didn't explain his presence, just materialized in the bay door the way he always did, like a man who navigated by instinct rather than intention. He set a box of fuel injectors on the workbench parts Jack hadn't ordered and wouldn't have been able to afford this week given the morning's chaos. Tom Wallace called me. Still trust you. So does Henderson. Those other calls are smoke. Smoke clears. He reached into his coat and produced a folded receipt. Mrs. Campbell is picking up Thursday. And I'm sending you the Jensen transmission next week. Full rebuild, they're paying top dollar. A pause. Starting tomorrow, I'm routing any overflow through your shop first. You need the work right now more than I need the referral fee. Jack opened his mouth to protest, and Hank cut him off with a look that carried the full weight of 3 decades of friendship with Jack's father and 11 years of quiet mentorship after his death. Your old man would have done the same for me. Did do the same more than once. This isn't charity, Jack. It's how things work. He placed the box of injectors precisely in the center of the bench, tapped the lid once, and walked out without saying goodbye because Hank Diller did not believe in goodbyes any more than he believed in long stories or unnecessary words. The box sat on the bench like a period at the end of a sentence Jack hadn't known how to finish. Wednesday morning broke open with the thing Jack had been dreading. He was in the kitchen making Lily's lunch peanut butter and honey because she declared grape jelly morally unacceptable 2 weeks ago for reasons she refused to articulate. When the front door opened and she walked in from the school bus stop 30 minutes early, backpack dragging, face a mask of fury and devastation arranged in equal parts. She'd been crying. The evidence was dried on her cheeks in salt tracks that she hadn't bothered to wipe, which meant the tears had been recent and the anger had overtaken the sadness before she'd had time to care about appearances. What happened? Lily dropped her backpack on the floor, a violation of the house rule that would normally earn a correction, and stood with her fists balled at her sides and her chin trembling with the effort of holding herself together. Brian Murphy said you're a criminal. He said that is why Mom left. He said his dad heard you were going to jail. She drew a breath that shuddered on the way in. The school counselor called me out of class. She asked if everything was okay at home, in front of everyone. The rage that hit Jack was unlike anything he had felt since the night Karen left. It was white and total and specifically targeted not at an 8-year-old bully or an overzealous counselor, but at the man who had put this machinery into motion. Farrell had crossed a line that Jack hadn't known existed until this moment, because until this moment, his concept of the fight had been bounded by adults and their adult consequences. Property damage, financial harassment, legal maneuvering. Those were weapons that hit people who could take the hit. But this, reaching into a school, poisoning the air around his daughter, using the cruelty of children as a delivery system for adult malice. This was something else. He knelt in front of Lily and held her face in his hands, oil-stained thumbs against tear-stained cheeks. I am not a criminal. I have never been a criminal. Your mother left because your mother left, and it had nothing to do with you, and nothing to do with what Brian Murphy's father heard from someone who was lying. He called Serena. His voice was controlled in the way that pressure-tested things are controlled steady because the alternative was an explosion. He's targeting my daughter. Serena arrived in 10 minutes. She walked through the door, and the expression on her face was something Jack had not seen before and hoped never to see directed at him, a cold, absolute fury that had been compressed into something diamond-hard and surgically precise. She crouched in front of Lily, took both her hands, and spoke in a voice that was somehow both gentle and terrifying. I know what happened, and I'm going to make sure it never happens again. We're going to beat him, Lily. We're going to beat him so badly that Brian Murphy's dad is going to pretend he never heard the name Dominic Farrell. But we're going to do it with evidence and lawyers and the truth, and when it's over, nobody will be able to say we fought dirty. Lily looked at her with the unblinking assessment of a child who has not yet learned to accept words at face value. Are you going to stay after you win? The silence lasted 4 seconds, 5, 6, long enough to become its own kind of answer. I hope so. Serena said it quietly, and the hope in the word was real, and the uncertainty was real, and for the first time since she had arrived in Cedar Falls, she sounded like someone who didn't have a plan for what came next. Lily, consider this. You should stay. You make Dad less grumpy. That evening, after Lily was in bed, Serena made the call. Jack heard it through the garage floor, her voice reaching him in fragments, through the joists and subfloor. Richard, listen to me carefully. I want a full investigation of Dominic Farrell. 24 hours, everything. Property records, tax filings, LLC registrations, offshore accounts, construction permits, campaign donations. This man just went after an 8-year-old girl. A pause that vibrated with contained violence. He made the worst mistake of his life. Show him what it come. Within the hour, a second call. This one Jack heard more clearly because Serena had come downstairs to the garage, pacing in the cold bay phone pressed to her ear, her breath clouding in the unheated air. Walter Briggs, 65 years old, a defamation attorney whose reputation in Oregon legal circles was spoken about the way certain mechanics spoke about certain engine builders with reverence and a trace of fear. He'd retired twice and come back both times because retirement bored him and injustice did not. Serena explained the situation in the terse language of someone briefing a general, and Briggs's response was apparently satisfactory because when she hung up, she told Jack that Briggs would be at the garage tomorrow morning. I can't afford a defamation attorney. You're not paying for it. I am. Consider it repayment for the worst futon in the Pacific Northwest. The joke was thin enough to be transparent, and beneath it, Jack could hear what she was actually saying, that she felt responsible, that his pain was connected to her presence, and that the only currency she had right now that was worth anything was the ability to deploy resources on behalf of someone who didn't have them. He wanted to argue. The self-sufficiency that had kept him upright for 7 years bristled at the offer the way of a territorial animal bristles at an intruder. But Lily's face was still behind his eyes, tear tracks and fury on her shirt, and pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Thursday's courtroom was a room Jack had never expected to see from the inside. Cedar Falls Municipal Court, second-floor fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly deceased. He wore a button-down shirt that felt like a costume and sat behind the plaintiff's table next to Serena and Diane while Walter Briggs organized papers with the unhurried confidence of a man who had done this so many times that the courtroom had become an extension of his living room. Farrell sat across the aisle. Jack saw him for the first time and cataloged the details the way he cataloged everything automatically without judgment, saving analysis for later. 55. Thinning hair combed with precision over a scalp that was losing the argument. A suit that was expensive but not tasteful, the sartorial equivalent of a car with too much chrome. And the eyes. That was where the real information lived. Cold in a way that wasn't intellectual but predatory, the gaze of someone who had learned to see other people as either tools or obstacles and had long since stopped wondering if there was a third category. Nolan had pulled Farrell's background for the case file, and the details painted a picture that complicated the simple narrative of a greedy landlord. Dominic Farrell had grown up in a trailer park outside Medford, son of a father who drank and a mother who cleaned houses for families that never learned her first name. He'd clawed his way out through a combination of community college night classes, construction jobs that broke his body, and a relentless corrosive hunger to never be poor again. The first property he'd bought was a duplex he'd renovated himself, sleeping in the unfinished unit while he taped drywall and laid tile. The second was bought with the profits from the first. By the time he owned 4, the hunger had metastasized into something else entirely, a conviction that the world owed him for every indignity of his childhood, and that the people who rented his properties were the same kind of people who'd look through his mother as if she were furniture. He didn't see tenants. He saw a debt the universe was paying back. When Farrell looked at Serena, the mask of civilized businessman flickered, and something underneath showed its teeth. I thought you'd have crawled back under whatever rock you came from by now. Serena's response was delivered without inflection, without heat, in the tone of someone reading a weather forecast for a city she'd never visit. I'm surprised you're not in prison yet, but I suppose these things take time. Briggs stood up and began dismantling Farrell's case with the methodical precision of a man disassembling a clock. He listed the pending actions. Civil fraud suit based on the lease violations documented by 9 tenants. Criminal referral for the staged property damage supported by photographic evidence of the reflection in the broken glass. Defamation claims arising from the harassment campaign against Jack Morrow's business and family. And a new element introduced with the casual timing of a card player who has been holding a Trump preliminary evidence of unreported income and potential tax fraud flagged by the forensic investigation Richard had initiated 48 hours ago, suggesting that at least 3 of Farrell's properties had been transferred to shell companies with offshore banking relationships. Farrell's attorney, a young man who was visibly recalculating the cost-benefit ratio of his client relationship, asked for a recess. The judge denied it. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Calloway, and she had been on the Cedar Falls bench long enough to have developed a fine-grained understanding of the difference between legitimate legal maneuvering and the weaponization of the court system. She looked at Farrell's restraining order petition, looked at the stack of counter-evidence Briggs had filed, and delivered her ruling with the kind of economy that suggested she'd made up her mind before the hearing started, but had wanted to see Farrell's face when the gavel came down. The restraining order against Jack was denied. A reciprocal order was granted. Instead, Farrell was prohibited from approaching, contacting, or communicating with Jack Morrow, Serena Caldwell, or any of the witnesses identified in the civil case. Any violation would result in immediate arrest. This is the 3rd protective order you've sought and had denied this calendar year, Mr. Farrell. I want to make something very clear. Filing frivolous orders is itself an offense, and my patience is not unlimited. Farrell left the courtroom the way a man leaves a room when every cell in his body wants to destroy it, but the last functioning circuit of his brain is reminding him that there are cameras, measured steps, straight spine, and his hands, which Jack watched with the attention of someone who understands that the body speaks truths. The mouth is trained to hide were clenched into fists so tight that the tendons stood out like cables on a suspension bridge, white and rigid, carrying a load they were never designed to bear. Friday detonated. Jack was pulling into the school parking lot to pick up Lily when his phone rang. The principal. Lily had punched Brian Murphy in the nose hard enough to draw blood because Brian had escalated from the rumors about Jack to something worse. Your dad's girlfriend is a rich witch who pays people to be her friends, and that's why your mom left, because your dad likes money more than family. Jack and Serena walked into the school together. He hadn't asked her to come. She'd been at the garage when the call arrived, and she'd stood up, put on her coat, and gotten into the truck without a word. The principal's office smelled like copy toner and carpet cleaner and the particular brand of institutional anxiety that accumulates in rooms where difficult conversations happen on a daily basis. Lily sat in a chair designed for someone twice her size, feet dangling 6 inches above the floor, hands folded in her lap, with a composure that was eerie in a child who had just broken someone's nose. The other child's blood was on her shirt, a crimson Rorschach blot on the collar that no one in the room could stop staring at. I'm not sorry. Her voice was small and absolute, the voice of someone who had weighed the consequences and accepted them. He said Dad was bad and Mom left because of him. That's a lie. I know it's a lie because I was there and Brian wasn't. Jack's chest compressed. The words he needed to say were the responsible ones, the ones about using words instead of fists, about consequences and self-control, and the difference between being right and being violent. But standing next to him was the woman his daughter was defending, and sitting in front of him was the child who'd inherited his stubbornness and his inability to walk away from injustice. And the geometry of the moment was such that the right thing to say and the true thing to feel were standing on opposite sides of a divide he couldn't bridge. Serena bridged it. She sat down next to Lily close enough that their arms touched and spoke in a voice that balanced gentleness in steel with a precision that Jack would later think about for a long time. I want to punch Dominic Farrell about 100 times this week, too. Every day I have to fight the urge. But what I've learned is that the people who hit you want you to hit back. Because the second you swing, you become the problem, and they become the victim, and everything you were right about disappears behind the bruise. We're going to beat him with the truth, and when we're done, every single person who believed the lies is going to feel ashamed that they did. Lily looked at Serena with the evaluative intensity that was her default mode of engagement with the adult world. Are you going to stay after? I hope so. You should. Dad smiles more when you're around, and he never smiles. That night, the garage, the cold. Two camp chairs by the space heater Jack kept for nights. When he worked late, the coils glowing orange in the dark bay, casting a radius of warmth that ended about 4 feet from where it started. Serena sat with her legs pulled up, shoes off, looking smaller than she'd ever looked, and more real. She'd been working 18-hour days for 10 consecutive days, and the toll had moved from her face into her bones, a weariness that lived in the way she held her shoulders and the way her hands lay open in her lap instead of clenched. Stay. Don't move to a hotel. Jack heard himself say it and recognized the sound of a decision that had been made somewhere below conscious thought, in the part of him that diagnosed engines by feel and knew when a bearing was about to fail before the instruments confirmed it. Why, genuine question, not a challenge. The genuine curiosity of someone who had spent years surrounded by people who wanted things from her and had almost forgotten what it sounded like when someone wanted something for her. The words came slowly, each one measured and placed like a shim in a valve assembly, precise because precision was the only language he trusted. Because whatever is happening between us, I want it to go all the way to the end. And I can't do that if you're hiding in some hotel room pretending you are not falling apart. Nothing happened. No kiss, no declaration, no movie scene resolution. Just two people sitting in a cold garage with a space heater between them and a silence that said more than any speech could have, a silence built not from absence, but from the presence of something too large and too new to fit into words. The fire in the heater hissed softly. Somewhere outside, a barn owl called once and didn't repeat itself. And Jack Morrow, who had not opened a door to anyone in 7 years, sat in his own garage and felt the architecture of his solitude shift, not collapsing, not breaking, but making room. Saturday morning, Serena was gone. Not the dramatic kind of gone, not the Karen kind of gone. The practical, painful, necessary kind. A note on the workbench in that pressurized handwriting, Diane says, I can't stay here during the trial preparation. Living with a witness undermines both our credibility. She found me a room at the Cedar Inn. I'm sorry, this isn't what I want, S. The loft was empty, the futon was made. The plant was still on the windowsill where Lily had placed it, its single brave leaf catching the morning light through glass that needed cleaning. Jack stood in the empty space and felt the silence fill it like water filling a hole breach, cold and total, and specifically wrong. 3 days. That was how long the absence lasted, and each day had the stretched quality of time that has lost its reason for moving forward. Jack worked, took the Campbell alternator job, the Jensen transmission, Hank had promised 2 oil changes, and a brake inspection. The routine held because the routine always held, because routines are the scaffolding you build around the parts of your life that can't support their own weight. Lily asked where Serena was every evening, and every evening Jack gave an answer that was technically true and emotionally bankrupt. She had to go somewhere else for a while. Hank noticed. Of course Hank noticed. Hank noticed everything and commented on nothing, which was his particular genius as a human being. But on the second day, he stayed 20 minutes longer than usual, ostensibly discussing a parts order for a truck he wasn't working on. And when he left, he'd somehow communicated through the medium of spark plug specifications and valve cover gasket prices that he was available if needed and would not ask questions. Ruth noticed louder. You look like someone stole your dog. I don't have a dog. Exactly. You don't have a do, you don't have a social life, and you just lost the one person who was making you act like a human being instead of a mechanic with a guilt complex. Call her. It's complicated. Jack, everything worth having is complicated. Your father was complicated. This garage was complicated. Lily is complicated. The only things in life that aren't complicated are the things that don't matter. On the third morning, Serena walked into the garage at 7:15, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner and nothing else. No suitcase, no explanation, no preamble. She set one cup on the workbench and held the other in both hands, and the cold had turned her cheeks pink, and her eyes had shadows under them that hadn't been there 3 days ago. I'm not good at running away anymore. She said it the way someone admits to a condition they have been diagnosed with and have decided to stop treating. Jack took the coffee. The warmth of the cup was absurd in its specificity, a small, hot circle against his palm that somehow anchored the moment to something physical and real. Good, because I'm not good at waiting. The next 2 weeks moved at the speed of purpose. Serena returned to the loft. The studio was repaired, the window replaced the furniture, righted the walls, patched. The photograph of Frank Morrison was sent to a restoration service in Portland. The war room expanded. Richard's investigation had yielded a comprehensive profile of Farrell's empire. 18 properties across 3 counties, 23 separate lawsuits filed by tenants over the past 5 years, and the discovery that 6 months ago, 3 properties had been transferred to a newly formed LLC with banking connections that ran through accounts no legitimate business would need. Nolan mentioned during one of his updates that Farrell's former office manager, a woman named Claire Dunning, had quit 4 months ago under circumstances nobody in the department had been able to clarify. She'd worked for Farrell for 6 years, handled the books, knew where every dollar went. Nolan couldn't find her. She'd moved out of state and wasn't returning calls. If she ever surfaces, he told Jack, she could blow this case wide open. Diane ran preparation sessions for the witnesses. Jolene Harris practiced her testimony at the kitchen table in her apartment, reading her notes aloud to her cat. Tyler Simmons organized his photographs into a chronological timeline his father helped him print and laminate. Linda Brewer gathered her fellow small business owners into an informal support group that met at the diner on Tuesday mornings. The community was assembling itself around the case the way a body assembles antibodies around an infection, slowly, specifically, with increasing force. Serena discovered something else, something she didn't share with the group, but told Jack about late one night sitting on the loft stairs while the garage cooled around them. Farrell had a connection to Ray Colton, a member of the Cedar Falls City Council. Construction permits for 3 of Farrell's recent renovations had been approved by Colton's committee in half the usual time, with inspection requirements waived. Campaign finance records showed donations from 2 of Farrell's LLCs to Colton's re-election fund, each one just under the reporting threshold, spread across enough entities to avoid pattern detection. This is bigger than one landlord and one studio. This is systematic. She said it not with surprise, but with the grim confirmation of someone who had suspected the disease was deeper than the symptom. That's a fight for after this one. Yes, but it matters to know the shape of what we're fighting. Diane met with Jack privately and the garage office door closed. They're going to come after you on the stand. They'll try to paint you as Serena's accomplice or her romantic interest who's manufacturing evidence to help her win. They'll use your feelings against you, against both of you. She paused. When they ask, tell the truth. Don't embellish. Don't speculate. And for God's sake, don't let them make you angry. Anger in a courtroom is a gift to the other side. What if they ask about me and Serena? They will ask about you and Serena, and you'll tell the truth about that too. Because the one thing we cannot afford is a lie, not one, not about anything. The morning of the trial arrived the way all consequential mornings arrive, with an alarm clock and a mundane routine that stands in absurd contrast to what's coming. Jack woke at 5. Fog outside, thick the valley, socked in with moisture that turned the streetlights into soft yellow planets. He stood in front of his closet and reached past the flannels and the work shirts to the back, where a single dress shirt hung in a dry cleaner's bag that was 4 years old. The shirt was white cotton conservative. The last time he had worn it was at his father's funeral. Lily appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, sleep-creased and solemn, holding the stuffed rabbit she'd officially outgrown a year ago, but still kept within arm's reach. "Are you going to win?" Jack turned from the closet and looked at his daughter, and the full weight of what he was about to do settled on him like snow settling on a roof. Quietly, steadily, each flake insignificant by itself, the accumulation capable of bringing down the structure. He was about to walk into a courtroom and testify against a man who had the resources to make his life substantially worse, and he was doing it because a woman had knocked on his door 10 days ago, and he'd made the choice to open it. "I'm going to tell the truth, Lily." Usually that's enough. He drove to the courthouse. Serena was already there, standing on the front steps, and the blonde Diane beside her. The fog was lifting, but hadn't committed to leaving hanging in shreds between the buildings like something reluctant to let go of the night. Serena wore the same black suit from the first court appearance, but something about her was different. Not her clothes, not her posture, her eyes. The controlled distance that had been her default since the night she arrived was gone, replaced by something more dangerous: clarity. She had stopped protecting herself from what she wanted and started protecting what she had. "Whatever happens in there, don't lie." Her voice was steady, stripped of performance, the voice of someone who had run out of room for anything that wasn't real. "Not about the case, not about the evidence, not about us." Jack looked at her on the courthouse steps, and the fog curled around them, and somewhere inside the building, a door opened, and a clerk called a case number, and the machinery of justice began its slow, imperfect, necessary rotation. Never. They walked inside. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor wax and the accumulated anxiety of every person who had ever sat in its pews, waiting for a verdict that would redraw the boundaries of their life. Cedar Falls Municipal Court was not a grand space. It held perhaps 80 people in its gallery, with high windows that let in the December light at angles that made the dust motes visible, tiny particles suspended in the air, like evidence of all the invisible things that fill a room where judgment is rendered. Jolene Harris sat in the second row wearing a navy dress she'd bought at the outlet mall in Salem the previous weekend, the tags removed that morning with kitchen scissors. She'd ironed it twice. Beside her, Tyler Simmons sat between his parents, his father's hand on his shoulder, in the particular way of men who communicate through pressure what they cannot communicate through language. Linda Brewer had brought 4 other small business owners from the Tuesday morning group at the diner, women and men who had no direct involvement in the case but who understood that their presence was a form of testimony that wouldn't appear in any transcript. They filled the first 3 rows behind the prosecution table with the quiet density of people who had come to watch the system do what they had been told it was supposed to do but had stopped believing it actually would. The prosecution's opening laid the foundation, the way a contractor lays a footing methodically without flourish. Each element placed to bear the weight of what would be built upon it. Lease agreements entered into evidence. Bank transfer records showing payments to Farrell's personal accounts rather than the property management company listed in the contracts. The fraudulent photographs with enlargements of the reflection that showed a watch and shoe that had no business being at a crime scene because they belonged to the man who had staged it. The timeline of harassment, the calls to Jack's customers, the approach to neighbors, the poisoning of a school environment that resulted in an 8-year-old girl being bullied with lies manufactured by an adult with a grudge. Farrell's defense attorney was a man named Gerald Whitfield. Mid-40s, the kind of lawyer who had built a practice on the principle that everyone deserves a defense and had somewhere along the way stopped asking whether his clients deserved his best effort. His opening painted Serena as the aggressor, a wealthy outsider who had descended on Cedar Falls with the resources to crush a local businessman and the motivation to do so because her ego could not tolerate being told no. The lease dispute was a misunderstanding. The additional fee was standard. The photographs were legitimate documentation of damage she had caused. The harassment claims were invented by a woman scorned and the blue-collar boyfriend she'd recruited to her cause. Jack sat behind the plaintiff's table and watched Farrell during Whitfield's opening. The man who had grown up in a trailer park outside Medford, who had clawed his way into property ownership through night classes and broken knuckles, sat in a suit that cost more than most of his tenants made in a month. The hunger that had driven him out of poverty had long since curdled into something unrecognizable, a machine that ran on resentment and control rather than ambition and survival. Jack could see it in the way Farrell's jaw tightened when Whitfield described Serena's wealth, a reflexive clench that spoke of old wounds dressed in new suits, the fury of a man who had spent his life proving he was better than the people who'd looked through him and had somewhere along the way become worse than all of them combined. The first day of testimony belonged to the tenants. Jolene took the stand at 10:15 and told her story in a voice that wavered on the first sentence and then found its footing and did not waver again. 3 years of fabricated maintenance charges. 3 years of lease terms that shifted like sand. 3 years of threatening letters that arrived with the regularity of utility bills and carried the same implicit message: pay or lose your home. She produced her accordion file, and the prosecution entered 47 separate documents into evidence, each one a brick in a wall that was growing taller with every witness. Whitfield's cross-examination attempted to establish that Jolene's record-keeping was obsessive, implying instability. Jolene's response was delivered with the flat precision of a woman who had spent 3 years waiting for this exact moment. I keep records because I'm a nurse. In my profession, documentation saves lives. In this situation, documentation is going to save mine. Tyler followed. His testimony was shorter, younger, less polished. But the three identical invoices spoke for themselves, and when the judge asked Whitfield whether his client had an explanation for billing a tenant $850 3 times for a repair that photographs showed had never been completed, the silence from the defense table lasted long enough to become its own kind of evidence. Linda Brewer's testimony introduced the pattern of commercial intimidation: leases signed without supplemental fees, fees introduced retroactively, locks changed when tenants protested. Her voice caught once when she described the 4 months she'd spent rebuilding her cleaning business from a card table in her sister's spare bedroom, and the gallery was quiet in the specific way that rooms become quiet when the person speaking has stopped performing their pain and started simply bearing it. By the end of the second day, 7 of the 9 tenants had testified. Each story was different in its details and identical in its architecture. Trust extended terms, violated retaliation, executed. The pattern was no longer something that required explanation. It was visible the way a crack in a foundation is visible once you know where to look. Not subtle, not ambiguous, not open to interpretation. Structural, systemic, deliberate. The third morning broke cold and bright, the kind of winter day that makes the mountains east of town look close enough to touch their peaks white against the sky so blue it seemed artificial. Jack drove to the courthouse in the dress shirt and sat in the hallway outside the courtroom for 20 minutes before his name was called, thinking about the conversation he'd had with Lily that morning. She'd been standing in the kitchen doorway, the rabbit tucked under one arm, watching him button his shirt with the critical attention of a child who has learned to read adults by their smallest gestures. "You look scared." He'd knelt down and the floor was cold through his dress pants, and his daughter's face at 6 in the morning had the unguarded quality of someone who hasn't yet assembled their defenses for the day. "I am scared, a little." Of what? And he'd thought about it, actually thought about it, instead of reaching for the reassuring deflection that parents use to protect their children from the knowledge that adults are afraid too, of saying the wrong thing, of not being enough. Lily had considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice weighing a constitutional question. "Just say true things, Daddy. You always tell me that lying makes everything worse. So just don't lie, even if it's hard." Now he sat in the hallway and the bailiff called his name and the courtroom door opened and he walked through it and up to the witness stand and placed his hand on a Bible and swore to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth and meant it with every cell in his body because his daughter had told him to and she was right. The prosecution walked him through the chronology. The night Serena arrived, the discovery of the least discrepancies, the decision to canvass Farrell's other properties, the tenants they'd found, the stories they'd heard, the pattern they'd assembled from 9 separate narratives that taken together described not a series of misunderstandings, but a business model built on exploitation. Jack answered each question the way he answered customers who asked what was wrong with their car, directly, specifically, without embellishment or apology. Facts, sequences, observations. The language of a man who had spent his professional life diagnosing problems by their symptoms and tracing them to their causes. When they got to the photographs, Jack described what he'd seen in the reflection, the watch, the shoe, the angle of the shadow that indicated the photographer was standing inside the room, not outside it. Whitfield objected. The judge overruled. Jack continued. He explained how he'd noticed the discrepancy not through legal training or investigative expertise, but through the habit of looking at reflective surfaces that his work had given him. Engines were full of chrome and polished steel and fluid reservoirs that showed you what was behind them if you understood how light behaved in confined spaces. The glass in Farrell's photograph had behaved the same way. It had told the truth about who was in the room when the damage was done. Then Whitfield stood up for the cross-examination, and the air in the courtroom changed the way air changes before a storm, a drop in pressure that everyone feels and no one can quantify. Mr. Morrow, you've been spending a great deal of time with Miss Caldwell over the past several weeks, isn't that correct? She's been living in the loft above my garage. Yes. And in that time, would you say a personal relationship has developed between the two of you? Diane was on her feet. Objection, relevance. Judge Calloway paused, adjusted her glasses, and looked at Whitfield with the expression of a woman who could see where this was going and wanted to hear how he planned to get there. I'll allow it with limitations. Counselor, get to your point. Whitfield turned back to Jack. Do you have romantic feelings for Ms. Caldwell? The courtroom went still. Not quiet. Still. The distinction mattered. Quiet was the absence of sound. Stillness was the presence of attention so concentrated that it created its own kind of silence. The held breath of a room full of people who knew they were witnessing a moment that would determine the shape of everything that followed. Jack looked at Serena. She was sitting behind the plaintiff's table, and her hands were gripping the edge of it, and she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the table's surface as if it contained instructions for how to survive the next 30 seconds. And Jack thought about lying. The word no was right there, simple, one syllable, a door he could close that would protect them both from whatever Whitfield planned to build on the answer. He thought about what a lie would cost and what the truth would cost and which currency he could afford to spend. He thought about Lily in the kitchen doorway. Just say true things, Daddy. No, we were not in a romantic relationship during the investigation. But yes, I have feelings for her. The words came out steady, not because he wasn't afraid, but because fear and honesty had reached an equilibrium in his chest, each one holding the other in place, the way opposing forces in an engine keep the pistons from flying through the block. And those feelings don't change a single fact I've testified to today. The least discrepancies are real. The fabricated photographs are real. The reflection in the glass is real. 9 tenants with matching stories are real. What I feel about Serena Caldwell is my business. What Dominic Farrell did to her and to those tenants is yours. The gallery erupted. Judge Calloway's gavel came down twice. Whitfield stood at his table looking like a man who had pulled a pin from what he thought was a smoke grenade and discovered it was something else entirely. He tried to recover, tried to suggest that Jack's feelings compromised his objectivity, that his observations about the photographs were colored by his desire to help the woman he cared about. But the evidence was physical, the reflection was measurable, the least discrepancies were documented, emotions could be questioned, but chrome didn't lie, and glass didn't have feelings, and the facts Jack had gathered existed independently of whatever was happening in his heart. Serena's hands had released the table edge. She was looking at him now, and the expression on her face was something he had never seen there before, an openness that had no armor behind it, no contingency, no exit strategy. It lasted 3 seconds. Then the professional mask reassembled itself because they were in a courtroom and there was a case to win, and whatever had passed between them in those 3 seconds would have to wait for a room that didn't have a judge and a jury and a man who wanted to destroy them both. Days 4 and 5 belonged to the experts and the surprise. A forensic accountant took the stand and walked the jury through Farrell's financial architecture with the patient clarity of a teacher explaining long division to a classroom that needed to understand at every step. 18 properties, revenue streams that didn't match the reported income, maintenance budgets that existed on paper but had no corresponding expenditures. And the shell company's 3 LLCs created within the past year, each one owning a property that had been transferred from Farrell's personal holdings, each one with banking arrangements that routed money through accounts designed to minimize visibility. Then came Claire Dunning, the former office manager Nolan had mentioned weeks ago, the woman who'd quit and disappeared. She contacted the prosecution independently after reading about the case in the Cedar Falls Gazette, driven 3 hours from her new home in Eugene, and sat in the hallway for 90 minutes before being called. Farrell's reaction when she entered the courtroom was the first genuine emotion Jack had seen crack through his performance. Not anger, fear, a brief involuntary widening of the eyes that was suppressed and almost immediately, but not before Jack caught it the way a mechanic catches the split-second shimmer of the leak in a pressurized line before the system compensates. Claire Dunning's testimony was devastating. She described the dual bookkeeping system she'd maintained at Farrell's direction, one set of records for tax purposes, one set reflecting actual income. She described the process of creating invoices for repairs that were never performed, maintenance fees that had no corresponding maintenance surcharges invented on a spreadsheet and attached to leases retroactively. She described Farrell's instructions to change locks on tenants who protested always after 5 p.m. on Fridays so that the tenants would have no access to legal assistance until Monday. She described the offshore accounts, the wire transfers, the money that moved through Farrell's empire, like blood through a body with multiple hearts, each one pumping in a direction designed to prevent any single observer from seeing the full circulatory system. Whitfield objected repeatedly. Judge Calloway overruled repeatedly. Farrell leaned over to whisper to his attorney, and whatever he whispered caused Whitfield to lean away slightly, the involuntary flinch of a man who has just been shown the true dimensions of the hole he's standing in. Closing arguments took 2 hours. The prosecution painted Farrell as a systematic predator who had built a business model on the exploitation of tenants too vulnerable to fight back. Man who had escalated from financial fraud to evidence fabrication, to witness intimidation to the targeting of a child. Each step, a logical progression in the calculus of a person who viewed other human beings as revenue sources and obstacles. The defense painted Serena as a wealthy outsider who had weaponized the legal system against a local businessman, and Jack as either her dupe or her co-conspirator. It was a thin argument stretched over a thick stack of evidence, and the strain showed in Whitfield's voice, which had acquired the particular quality of a man who knows he's lost and is performing for the record rather than the jury. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Jack spent them in the hallway with Serena and Diane and Jolene and Tyler and Linda and the others, the small tribe that this case had assembled from disparate lives and forged into something that resembled a community. Nobody said much. Tyler played a game on his phone. Jolene read a paperback she'd brought in her purse, a medical thriller that she kept losing her place in because her eyes drifted to the courtroom door every 30 seconds. Linda sat with her hands folded and her eyes closed. Ruth had driven up from the house with a bag of sandwiches nobody asked for, and everyone ate because Ruth Morrow understood that in moments of crisis, the most useful thing a person can do is make sure nobody faces it hungry. Jack and Serena sat side by side on a wooden bench that had been worn smooth by decades of anxious waiting. Their shoulders touched. Neither of them moved away. The jury returned at 4:17 p.m. The foreman stood a retired school teacher named Donald Chambers, who had been selected because he was the oldest member of the panel and therefore presumably the most patient, and read the verdicts in a voice that carried the weight of collective deliberation. Fraud, guilty. Witness intimidation, guilty. Tax evasion, guilty. Every count, every charge. Guilty across the board, a clean sweep that left no ambiguity and no appeal angle, and no room for the kind of legal maneuvering that had been Farrell's primary tool for the past decade. Serena made no sound. Her hand found Jack's on the bench between them, and her fingers closed around his, and the grip was fierce and trembling, and communicated more than any verdict could about what this moment cost and what it meant. Jolene Harris stood up in the second row and said yes in a voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom and probably to the parking lot beyond. Tyler's mother put her face in her hands. Linda Brewer sat perfectly still and let tears run down her cheeks without wiping them, because some tears are not about sadness and do not need to be hidden. Farrell stood motionless while the bailiff approached. The handcuffs made a sound when they closed, a metallic click that was small and final and carried in the silent courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. He was let out through the side door, and the last thing Jack saw was the back of his suit jacket, expensive, impeccably pressed, disappearing through a doorway that led to a future he had built for himself, one fraudulent invoice at a time. Outside the courthouse, the December afternoon was doing something unexpected. The overcast had broken. Not completely, not dramatically, but enough to let a band of golden light through the western clouds, the kind of light that photographers call magic hour and that ordinary people just call beautiful. It fell across the courthouse steps, in the parking lot, in the faces of the people standing in it, and Jack thought that weather had no right to editorialize, but apparently didn't care about jurisdiction. The victory was real but incomplete. Two of Jack's largest accounts had quietly transferred their business during the weeks of disruption. Tom Wallace had stayed loyal and misses them. Henderson would bring the Camry back until one of them died, but the delivery fleet contract from Ridgeline Logistics was gone and the municipal vehicle maintenance agreement was under review. 15% of his monthly revenue vanished into the atmosphere of rumor that Farrell had manufactured. Lily would start at Westfield Elementary after winter break, 12 miles away, instead of 4, because the social environment at her old school had been poisoned beyond what a guilty verdict could clean. Hank materialized beside him on the courthouse steps, as he always materialized, without announcement or preamble. He clapped Jack on the shoulder once, the way men of his generation communicated love, and his palm was warm and heavy, and carried the specific weight of someone who had been watching this unfold and had drawn his conclusions. You did right. Customers will come back, or new ones will come. Clients who leave you can replace them. A clear conscience, you can't buy that at any price. The sentencing hearing fell in the middle of December, 2 weeks before Christmas, on a day when Cedar Falls woke to its first real snow of the season. 7 years, federal prison, full restitution to all affected tenants, forfeiture of properties acquired through fraudulent proceeds. Serena spoke to the reporters on the courthouse steps. She answered questions about the case, the tenants, the significance of the verdict. And then a reporter from the Gazette asked the question that everyone had been waiting for. Ms. Caldwell, your company headquarters are in San Francisco. Will you be returning to lead Caldwell Innovations? I'm staying in Cedar Falls. I found something here that I didn't know I was missing, and I'm not willing to give it up just because it doesn't fit on a balance sheet. The decision had not been made on the courthouse steps. It had been made in stages in conversations Jack felt in the way Serena's voice changed when she spoke about her company. The board wanted her back. Nathan Cole's accusations had been dismissed. The asset freeze lifted. The pressure was considerable. She turned it all down. Stepped back to an advisory role, retained her board seat, and signed a one-year lease on the Prescott Building studio that had started everything. I built that company from nothing, from a napkin sketch in my grandfather's kitchen when I was 22. Walking away feels like leaving a child. She paused. But I've spent 10 years building an empire, and I don't want another empire. I want a community. I want to build something where the people I help can look me in the eye. The center opened in February on a Saturday when the last of the winter snow was retreating from the sidewalks, and the air held the first distant rumor of spring. Serena had transformed the studio into a shared workspace on the ground floor, with refurbished desks and reliable internet, a consultation room for free legal and financial advice, and a small library of business books that Ruth had organized with the ferocious efficiency of a woman who had finally been given an official responsibility and intended to execute it as though civilization depended on the Dewey Decimal System. Ruth had also appointed herself the unofficial greeter social director and moral authority of the establishment, and she performed these roles with the same combination of warmth and interference that she brought to every aspect of her family's life. Jolene Harris ran in operations. She'd left her nursing agency and taken the position because, as she told Jack, I spent 20 years keeping strangers alive on night shifts. It's time to keep something alive during the day. Tyler handled the technology. Linda managed the outreach and marketing. The whole town came. They filled the space and spilled onto the sidewalk and ate the food that Ruth had organized. Ruth herself held court near the refreshment table, telling anyone who would listen, and several people who were trying not to, that she had known from the very first Sunday at church that this was exactly how things would turn out. I told Serena that day, she announced to a group of women from the garden club, my son will help you. He doesn't know it yet, but he will. And here we are. Hank stood next to Jack at the back of the room holding a bottle of beer. He watched Serena at the podium, speaking about second chances and showing up, and he took a drink and said without looking at Jack, she did good. Your old man would be proud. The words landed on something in Jack's chest that had been sealed for 11 years. His father, who had run this garage for 31 years and had never turned away a customer who couldn't pay. His father, who had died of a heart attack in Bay 2 on a Thursday afternoon while rebuilding a water pump, who had fallen with a wrench still in his hand. His father, who had left behind tools on a pegboard and advice that still turned up at the moments when Jack needed something to hold on to. April came gently to Cedar Falls the way spring always came to the valley, not with dramatic flourishes, but with the quiet insistence of green things pushing through cold ground. The hills above town turned from brown to emerald, and the cherry trees along Main Street burst into bloom with the extravagant generosity of organisms that don't know how to be modest. Jack closed the garage early on a Thursday. He drove to pick up Serena, who had rented a small house 3 blocks from the garage, and Lily, who had claimed the back seat with the territorial certainty of an 8-year-old who has decided that this configuration of humans is her preferred arrangement. They drove to the reservoir east of town and spread a blanket on the grassy bank and ate sandwiches that Lily had insisted on making herself, which meant the peanut butter was applied with the subtlety of spackling compound, and the honey had gotten into places honey should never go. Lily threw rocks into the water with the methodical intensity she brought to everything. Between throws, she reported on Westfield Elementary. Mrs. Paulson gives too much homework, but she lets us read during lunch. Dylan Cooper has a dog that comes to pick up, and everyone pets it. The library has a fish tank, and the big fish is named Gerald. Serena had given Jack a key to the studio. Come teach them what you know, how to build something from nothing, how to read a contract the way you read an engine, how to notice the things that everyone else misses. Jack had taken the key. Lily comes first, always. I know, that's one of the reasons I'm asking. And you have to promise me something that you'll actually live, not just work, not just build. Let it be enough. Serena considered this. That's going to be hard, especially if you tried to do it with me. Deal. Lily's voice carried from the water's edge, bright and certain. Are you guys in love now? Is this the part where you kiss? Jack looked at Serena. Serena looked at Jack. The sun was doing something to the reservoir that turned the surface into hammered gold, and a red-tailed hawk was circling above the dam. That's both a question and a statement, isn't it? Lily shrugged with the full-body eloquence of a child who finds adults unnecessarily slow. Obviously, can we get ice cream? They got ice cream, the garage at closing time, the same garage, the same concrete floor, the same pegboard with the same tools hanging in the same outlines. But the light was different. The bay doors were open to the April evening, and the sunset was painting everything the color of warm copper. And on the windowsill above the shop sink, the small plant that Lily had placed there weeks ago had grown a second leaf reaching toward the glass with the unreasonable optimism of living things. Next to the plant propped against the window frame was a photograph in a restored frame. An older man in a hard hat grinning on a building site. Frank Morrison, who had taught his granddaughter that buildings were honest and that people revealed their character in how they treated those who couldn't help them. The frame had come back from the restoration service with new glass and a note from the restorer. Some things are worth saving. Jack stood at the top of the loft stairs and looked down at the garage floor. Serena was at the desk and the corner laptop open, but she looked up when she heard him and smiled, and the smile was not the careful, constructed expression he'd first seen on the courthouse steps, but something unguarded, the smile of a person who has stopped building walls and started building windows. Lily's backpack was by the door. Ruth would drop her off in an hour and the three of them would eat dinner at the workbench, because that had somehow become the center of gravity, the unlikely place where their lives intersected. He walked down the stairs. Serena closed the laptop. Through the open bay doors, the cherry trees on Main Street were dropping their last blossoms onto sidewalks that would need sweeping, and the mountains beyond town were lit with the kind of alpine glow that makes you want to stand still and memorize the moment. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open the door when someone knocks. You never know who's standing on the other side. Nathan Cole's lawsuit was still pending. Jack's reputation was healing but scarred. Lily still woke up some nights from dreams she wouldn't describe. The road ahead contained problems they hadn't imagined yet, and ordinary days that would outnumber the extraordinary ones by 1,000 to 1. But the garage was warm, and the door was open, and the plant on the windowsill was growing, and somewhere in the distance, a barn owl called once in the fading light. And Jack Morrow, mechanic, father, reluctant hero of a story he never asked to be part of, reached for the light switch at closing time, and for the first time in 7 years, left it on.